In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced Soviet hikers trekked into the Ural Mountains, and they never returned. When the rescuers finally found their camp, the tent had been sliced open from the inside. Their bodies were scattered across the snow. Some were half-dressed. Some had severe injuries as if they'd been hit by a car. 2 of them were missing their eyes, and 1 was missing her tongue. The Soviet government called it a compelling natural force, and then quietly buried the files. And for over 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass Incident has become one of the most debated mysteries in modern history. People say it was the KGB, a Yeti, secret military experiments, infrasound weapons that drove the hikers insane. And the theories just get wilder and wilder. And honestly, it's understandable, because this case is genuinely strange. But here's what I find even more interesting than the theories themselves. A couple of scientists eventually decided to actually do the maths. And what they found, using computer simulations, avalanche modelling, and believe it or not, animation code from the movie Frozen, of all things. And it might just be the closest thing to an answer that we are ever going to get. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, and more specifically, what happens when science finally takes it seriously. One of the most frustrating things about the Dyatlov Pass story is how the hikers themselves have been buried under 60 years of conspiracy theories. In the retellings, they're often reduced to just names on an autopsy report. But before they were a mystery, they were just a group of friends. They were engineering students in their early 20s, fit, smart, and by every objective measure, incredibly experienced in the wild. The group was led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov from the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlov, the city that's now known as Yekaterinburg. He was well regarded in Soviet hiking circles, had led previous expeditions, and by most accounts was a careful, organised leader. He'd personally assembled the team and mapped the route. This wasn't an impulsive adventure. It was a properly planned expedition, formally approved by the local authorities before they'd even packed their bags. The group originally had 10 members, although one of them, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to knee and joint pain, a decision that ultimately saved his life. The remaining 9 were a mix of students and graduates from the institute, along with 37-year-old Semyon Zolotarov, a veteran of World War II, and a sport instructor who was working towards his highest hiking qualification. He was significantly older than the rest of the group, and by some accounts, a slightly mysterious figure. He went by the name Sasha, rather than his own, but he was brought along for his experience, and that was enough. On the 23rd of January 1959, the group left Sverdlov by train. They travelled north, eventually continuing by truck to the last inhabited settlement on their route. On the 27th of January, they set off on foot into the wilderness towards their goal, a mountain peak called Gora Ortorten in the northern Urals. The route they were following was the hardest category of expedition in the Soviet Union at the time. On January the 28th, Yudin turned back, and he never saw his friends again. And this is one of the things that makes this case so disturbing, I think. There are actual photographs from the trip. There are diary entries you can still read today. You can see photos of the group smiling and messing around in the snow. They even made a little mock newspaper for the expedition, which they named The Evening of Torten, complete with jokes between themselves, including a headline that read, "From now on, we know that snowmen exist." In the final diary entries found at the camp, the mood was good. They were tired, moving a little slower than planned because of the weather, but they were happy. And then on the night of the 1st or the 2nd of February 1959, the exact date still remains uncertain. Everything went wrong on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. Kholat Syakhl, by the way, translates from the local Mansi language as Dead Mountain, which is the kind of name you'd rather not know about until after you've already set up camp. The group set up on the eastern slope, roughly 1,100 meters above sea level. When the rescue team found the camp on February the 26th, nearly 4 weeks after the group was last seen alive, the tent was badly damaged and partially collapsed. It had been cut open from the inside, with multiple knife slashes. Most of the group's gear Their boots, their coats, and their food were still inside. Whatever had driven them out had done so very fast. There were 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent, heading downhill towards the tree line about 1.5 kilometers away. Many of the prints showed they were walking in just their socks or barefoot. After about 500 meters, the tracks disappeared under the snow. At the tree line, beneath a large cedar tree, rescuers found the remains of a small fire and the first 2 bodies. Yuri Doroshenko, who was 21 years old, and Georgy Krivonishenko, who was 23, known to his friends as Yura. Both were found dressed in only their underwear. The branches of the cedar tree were broken up to about 5 meters off the ground, suggesting that one of them had climbed up, probably trying to see the tent from above. 3 more bodies were found between the tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself was found about 300 meters from the tree. Rostan Slobodin about 480 meters, and Zenida Kolmogorova about 630 meters. All 3 appeared to be making their way back towards the tent when they died. The official cause of death for all 5 was hypothermia. They had simply frozen to death. That alone would have been a tragedy. 9 experienced hikers driven from their tent by something and dying of cold on a mountainside. It's unimaginable, but not necessarily inexplicable. Then in May, when the snow began to melt, searchers found the remaining 4 bodies in a ravine about 75 meters further into the woods from the cedar tree. And this is where it becomes genuinely hard to explain. Nikolay Fiba Brignol, who was 23, had major fractures to his skull. Ludmila Dubinina, who was 20, had severe fractures to her chest and was also missing her tongue, her eyes, and parts of her lips and facial tissue. Semyon Zolotarov, who had actually just turned 38 on the very night he died, had major chest fractures as well, and was also missing his eyes. And Alexander Kolvatov, who was 24, was found beside them, but his body didn't have the same degree of injuries as the others. The forensic pathologist said that the force needed to cause the skull and chest injuries without leaving any visible cuts or bruises on the bodies was similar to what you'd expect in a car crash. This was not the kind of damage that another person could inflict. It was more like they had been crushed, as though something very heavy had pressed down on them from above. On top of all of this, some of the group's clothing tested positive for low-level radioactive contamination, a detail that, as you can imagine, did absolutely nothing to make the investigation any easier. And so the Soviet inquest, which had moved quickly and without much care, wrapped up in May of 1959, with the conclusion that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. The files were classified, and the case was closed. For the next several decades, the Dyatlov Pass incident became a magnet for every wild theory imaginable. And look, I get it. On the surface, the facts are genuinely strange. Experienced hikers flee a tent in the middle of the night, half-dressed in temperatures approaching -30. Several of them end up with injuries you'd expect from a car crash, but with no marks on the outside of their bodies. And a woman is found missing her tongue and eyes. So it's no surprise that conspiracy theories have grown over the years. Some of the most common ones include a Soviet military cover-up, possibly involving weapons testing, and various versions of an infrasound theory, where naturally occurring low-frequency sound waves supposedly induced panic and disorientation into the group. There was also significant discussion of the Mansi people, an indigenous group native to the region, who some suspected had attacked the hikers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was largely dismissed when investigators found no footprints on the mountain beyond those of the hikers themselves, and no physical evidence of a struggle. An avalanche was actually one of the very first theories to be proposed. It was also one of the first to be dismissed. And this is important for what comes later, because the slope above the tent wasn't steep enough for a normal avalanche. Avalanches need a fairly steep hill to get going, and by standard measurements, this one wasn't there. There was also no physical evidence left behind, no debris, and no disturbed snow that the rescuers could see. Then there was the strange nature of the injuries. They simply didn't match what you'd normally expect from a snowslide. so the theory was shelved. Russia eventually reopened the investigation in 2019, and in 2020 officially announced that an avalanche had probably been responsible for the deaths. But the report was widely criticised for not explaining the details, addressing the missing evidence, or explaining the cause of the specific injuries. They'd simply given a conclusion without explaining how they'd actually come to it. And that's essentially where things stood when a journalist rang a Swiss snow scientist named Johann Guam and asked for his thoughts. Guam had never actually heard of the Dyatlov Pass before that very call. He worked at the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at a university in Lausanne, Switzerland, studying how snow behaves, how it moves, and how it can kill people. And when this journalist explained the case to him, Guam felt that the avalanche theory may have been dismissed too quickly. He got in touch with Alexander Puzrin, an engineering professor at another Swiss university in Zurich, and the two of them began working on it together. What they were looking into wasn't a regular avalanche. It was something called a slab avalanche, and the difference is really important. Think about it this way. Imagine you've got a thick slab of packed hardened snow sitting on top of a layer of soft, loose snow beneath, like a heavy concrete tile balanced on a pile of sand. The sand isn't strong enough to hold it forever, and if you add weight to the top or chip away at the bottom, eventually the whole thing slides. That's a slab avalanche. And the key thing about slab avalanches, compared to regular ones, is that they don't need a very steep slope. They can happen on a much gentler terrain, and they can be triggered by something small, and then not actually slide until hours later, once extra weight has built up on top. This is where the tent became the key piece of the puzzle. When the group set up camp, they did something completely normal for winter camping. They dug a flat ledge into the slope to pitch their tent on. They did this so that their tent sat level rather than sliding downhill. But according to Guam and Puzrin's research, cutting into the snow like that may have weakened the layer of snow above them, like pulling a brick from the base of a wall. The snow above didn't collapse straight away, but during the night, strong winds blew more and more snow down from the higher mountain, steadily piling weight onto that already weakened spot. The winds, known as katabatic winds, cause cold air to roll down the mountain at night as temperatures drop, carrying a lot of snow with them. Weather records, later checked by a Russian meteorologist, confirmed that the conditions that night were well within the range needed for the slab to eventually give way. And there was one more thing the original investigators had no way of knowing. When Guam and Puzrin visited the site with drones in 2021, they discovered that the terrain under the snow was full of hidden drop-offs and ledges. Steep-like features, only about a metre tall, but completely invisible once the snow settled over them. To anyone looking at the slope, it appeared smooth and gentle. Underneath it, however, was far less stable than it looked. This was almost certainly why Dyatlov, an experienced hiker, had thought the location was safe to camp on, because on the surface it was. The danger was hidden. Their model showed that under the conditions of that specific night, the cut into the slope, the extra snow blown down from above, and the hidden terrain beneath the snow could have caused the slab to release several hours after the group went to sleep. But it wouldn't have been huge. It wouldn't have been a dramatic wall of snow sweeping down the mountain. It would have been a dense, heavy block, roughly the size of a large SUV, around 5 meters long, sliding across the tent while everyone inside was asleep. This is the part of the research I found most impressive, because those injuries have always been the main argument against any avalanche explanation. Snow doesn't crush ribs like a car crash. Or does it? Well, here's where it gets genuinely interesting. To work out whether a slab of snow could really cause those kind of injuries, Guam and Puzrin needed two things: a way to model how snow moves when it hits something, and a way to model what happens to a human body when it gets hit. For the snow movement, Guam actually went to Hollywood. He'd seen the Disney film Frozen and thought the snow in it looked unusually realistic. So he tracked down the team who animated it and asked them how they'd done it, and came home with their actual code. He then adapted it to simulate a real slab avalanche hitting a tent. For the body impact side of things, they used data from crash tests that General Motors had conducted back in the 1970s. tests originally intended to understand car accident injuries. Some of those crash tests had been done with the subjects lying on rigid hard surfaces. That mattered because something specific about how the group had set up their sleeping area. They had placed their bedding on top of their skis, so they were effectively sleeping on a hard, flat platform. The crash test setup matched almost exactly, and what the simulation showed was this. A dense slab of snow moving at a relatively low speed but with a lot of weight, pressing down on people laying on a hard surface through a layer of tent fabric could absolutely produce the kind of injuries that were found on the 4 bodies in the ravine. The weight spreads across the whole slab like a heavy press rather than a single punch, which is why there were no cuts or bruises on the bodies. The damage was on the inside from the pressure. And crucially, the injuries, as severe as they were, would not have killed everyone immediately. They would have still been able to move for at least a while. So when you put all of this together, the sequence of events from that night starts to make a lot more sense. Sometime in the night, the slab releases. It slides across the tent. The impact is violent enough to cause serious injuries to at least some of the people sleeping inside, including the crushing chest and the skull fractures found on the floor in the ravine. The tent collapses under the weight, and the group wakes up in darkness, in pain, with the tent pressing down on them. They cut their way out with a knife, and here's something that often gets misunderstood about this case. The footprints leading away from the tent were consistent with people walking at a calm, normal pace, not running and not panicking. They were moving quickly, but under control. Because what they were doing was completely rational. They believed a much larger avalanche might be about to follow, and needed to get off of that slope. The 2 who reached the cedar tree, Yuri and Georgi, appear to have tried to start a fire to stay warm. The burns on Georgi's body are important here. He had 3rd-degree burns, which means he was definitely still alive and conscious at that fire for quite a while before he eventually lost consciousness. He didn't just collapse and fall in. The 4 who were more seriously hurt were most likely helped down towards the ravine by those who were less injured. The ravine offered some shelter from the wind, so they built a rough sleeping platform out of cut branches. The remains of this were found by searchers in May, and they tried to survive the night, but it wasn't enough. The 3 found between the tree and the tent, Igor, Rustim and Zenaida, appeared to have been trying to make their way back to camp once they realized that no more avalanches were coming. Maybe it was for their gear, their boots, or even their sleeping bags. All 3 had been clearly moving in the right direction when the cold finally stopped them. As for the missing eyes, tongue and soft tissue on some of the ravine bodies, they were buried under the snow for roughly 3 months before being found in May. The loss of soft tissue like that over that length of time in that environment is consistent with the effects of decomposition and scavenging animals. Unglamorous, but it's what happens. The pathologist who examined them also noted that those injuries appeared to have happened after death. And the radiation on some of the clothing. Well, the most likely explanation is Georgy Krivonashenko. Before the expedition, he had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility, the same site where a massive nuclear accident, the Kishtim disaster, had occurred in 1957, just 2 years earlier. Workers there were regularly exposed to low levels of radiation, and traces of that contamination can cling to clothing for years. From there, clothes get shared, swapped, or even just come into contact with each other. That said, this explanation doesn't account for everything, and the radiation question is honestly one of the few genuinely unresolved details in the whole case. Guam and Puzrin published their findings in January 2021 in a scientific journal connected to Nature, one of the most respected science publications in the world. The reaction was significant, but not everyone was convinced. The main criticism was particularly from Russian researchers and the Dyatlov Foundation, a group that was specifically set up to continue investigating the case, was that there was still no physical evidence of an avalanche from the original 1959 search. The rescuers had been there. They'd reported no slide. The footprints were intact. How could an avalanche leave so little behind? So the researchers went back. On the 28th of January 2022, exactly 63 years after the Dyatlov group was last seen alive, two mountain guides from Ekaterinburg made the trip to Kholat Syakhl on snowmobiles, in conditions described as similar to those on the night of the tragedy. The winds were so violent that the snowmobiles were knocked over multiple times. Visibility dropped to nearly zero, and when conditions briefly cleared, what they found was significant. Two fresh slab avalanches on that very mountain. Then in January 2023, a slab avalanche was photographed on the actual slope where the Dyatlov group's tent had been pitched. Not somewhere nearby, the same slope, under similar winter conditions. And the reason the 1959 rescuers found nothing comes down to scale. The slab that came down on the tent was small and localized. It didn't sweep the whole slope or leave wreckage behind. It slid across the tent and settled. The snow around it, including the footprints, stayed largely undisturbed. Small slab events regularly leave almost no visible evidence, which is exactly why this one was so easy to write off. Now I want to be honest with you here, because I think this matters in a case like this. Guam and Puzrin have never said they fully solved the Dyatlov Pass incident. Their paper says they've shown that the avalanche explanation is plausible, but that also means it isn't proven. The Dyatlov Foundation still argues that the absence of any avalanche evidence from 1959 is too hard to explain away. Some researchers dispute the slope's measurements, and some reports claim to have seen strange orange glowing spheres in the sky over the area that night, including Russian military and meteorological observers that have never been explained by anyone. And Guam himself, when asked about the public's reaction to the paper, said something I think is genuinely insightful. People don't want it to be an avalanche, he said. It's too normal. And there's something real in that. The Dyatlov Pass has spent more than 60 years becoming a legend, and a delayed snow slab, however unusual and scientifically interesting, doesn't quite scratch the itch. It doesn't feel big enough. It doesn't feel like it earns all the mystery. But when you look at what the evidence actually supports, the slab theory does something that none of the other explanations have ever managed. It explains how those injuries happened. It explains why experienced people ran from their tent without their boots. It explains the orderly footprints. It explains the knife cuts from the inside of the tent. It explains the delay between setting up the camp and whatever hit them in the night. And it has now been backed up by expeditions that actually went to the site and watched slab avalanches happen on that very mountain. The 9 hikers of the Dyatlov group were Igor Dyatlov, Rustem Slobodin, Zenaida Kolmogrova, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonashenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolvatov, Nikolai Fiba Brignol, and Semyon Zolotarov. They were, by every account, capable, enthusiastic, and young. Their last diary entries were cheerful. Their group newspaper was full of jokes. They went out onto the mountains, and they didn't come back. What I keep coming back to with this case is what happens when a mystery gets bigger than the truth. For 60 years, the gap left by "we don't know" got filled with everything from government conspiracies to supernatural forces, because people find a gripping unknown far easier to sit with than a horrible accident. And maybe that says something about us. What Guam and Puzrin did wasn't dramatic. It was patient. They built models. They ran simulations. They flew drones over a mountain in a remote part of Russia. They organized expeditions in winter conditions so bad that they nearly got thrown off their snowmobiles. And slowly, carefully, they put together a case for something far simpler, yet somehow more devastating than any of the theories that had come before. 9 people went to sleep on a slope that looked safe in the dark. But something shifted that night, and none of them made it home. Years before the hikers set foot on the dead mountain, a family on a remote Bavarian farm found footprints in the snow that led towards their house, but never away. Their story holds a different kind of isolation. so be sure to watch our deep dive into the Hinterkaifeck murders next. But for now, the facts remain and the ledger is closed.